not going to use the microphone. Is that all right with people? Can you hear me all right?
Let's just check. Can you pick up the recording?
Oh, can you pick up the recording? All right. And hopefully, I mean, the microphone's not going to be any help with my terrible American accent, so we're just going to have to deal with it as is. First, thank you very much to Kosnadi and Benoit for having me here, and to my other panelists. This is a great thrill to be here. And when I saw the subject that we had been given to discuss, Black theology from 1960 to the present, I was a little bit overwhelmed because as a historian by training, one of the things that we do as historians is we always limit what it is we're talking about, so that when people ask us questions, we can say, well, I don't know about that. I only know about this one specific thing. And the book that I published on Black consciousness, which is in large part on Black theology, is about the period from 1968 to 1977. So I'm going to limit my very brief comments to that today, and hopefully the other panelists will be able to expand in time. Also, as a historian, which is, I think, a unique presence on the panel, I'm not a theologian. I'm not South African. I'm obviously not Black, nor, in full disclosure, am I a Christian. But despite all those reasons, this is something that I have spent a lot of time studying, a lot of time thinking about, and I hope that what I have found is somewhat useful for beginning this conversation. The book that I wrote is an intellectual history of what is to become the Black consciousness movement from 1968 to 1977. And so what it begins by looking at is how the people who later become known as leaders of Black consciousness, people like Steve Biko and others, where they came from in the 1960s and how it was they began to develop their ideas. And when I was doing this research a few years ago, when I spent a year in South Africa doing this research, and I've made many trips since, I was repeatedly struck by how often it was that they referred to Christianity. How often and how apparent it was that Christianity was intrinsic to how they understood themselves and how they understood the political problems and social problems that they were facing in South Africa at the time. And from that, I began to explore the development of this theological critique, and I began in particular to explore this question of Black theology, which is the term that by 1971 they had arrived at to describe this new approach to analyzing Christianity in light of the political realities of South Africa at the time. Now, there's a lot more to say about that. I only have 5 minutes. This book is, 200 pages long, so obviously there's going to be some disconnect. But for purposes of the discussion now, I think there's a couple of things that my research found that I think might be interesting to reflect on. One is to ask the question is, given that Black theology emerged from a particular set of historical circumstances, which was the late 1960s, early 1970s in South Africa, how applicable is it today? How applicable are things that emerge at a particular moment in time outside of that time? And let me give you an example of how I think this might apply. In South Africa in the early 1970s, in 1971, 1972, when the first what were called Black theology seminars were being held, which were attended by people like Biko and Barney Pichana and these others. To describe yourself as Black meant something very specific and very historical. It meant that being Black, there were Indians who participated in Black theology seminars, there were coloreds who participated in Black theology seminars. It was even organized in part by whites. And the question of whites is something that we can bring in. But the idea, though, to be Black in that time period in 1970, 1971, 1972, was to claim an inclusive racial identity that wasn't about skin color, but was about political position, which was, it was to say, those people without rights in South Africa under the political system of the time. Given that, and given that that's what Black meant, how applicable is the term today? When we call it Black theology today, are we stretching the sort of bounds of historical understanding in a sense? Related to that, there is a question of what it meant to be Black as a philosophical category, not just a legal category. And for people at the time in the 1970s, in 1970, 1971, it also meant that you were dedicated to some form of liberation. The question of what exactly that liberation was to be is one that came later. But all it meant in the early 1970s was that you were dedicated to liberation. You were dedicated to fighting against the system however you possibly could. And it's in that, I think, to kind of contradict my first point, that I think we might actually see it as somewhat timeless, which is to say that perhaps Black theology is best understood as a practice of Christians at various moments and in various places, which has in common the idea that to be a Christian is to be engaged in struggles for liberation. There was a very famous quote, at least famous people who've read my book and in my own head, by one of the leaders of the University Christian Movement, which was one of these organizations that had a lot to do with SASA during the early 1970s. A man named Justice Moloto, who was the first black president of that organization. And he was writing about what it means to be a Christian. In 1970, he wrote, what it means to be a member of a church. And he said, the church is the company of liberators, or it is not the church. And many people, he said this publicly, and he was excoriated by people who said that you essentially are limiting Christianity to political practice. And I think that question of whether or not he was and whether or not he ought to have done so is an interesting question to engage. And we can also engage, as a corollary to it, this notion of timelessness, that to be a black theologian, in a sense then, is to be always engaged in struggles for liberation. And those, regardless of the historical circumstance, those are universal and those are timeless. And perhaps we can engage in it on that level as well. I think that's about 5 or 6 minutes.
Well done.
Okay.